and all the and we will also push this on YouTube later for people to watch. So just to give you a context for this panel, so we are working in collaboration with the Blockchain Connected Council in Wales, which both Imtiaz and I belong to. So we have a very active blockchain community here in Cardiff also. So we have 5 panelists here. So we have Jason and Sinclair Davidson from RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, who are also happen to be at the same place where this conference is being run in Melbourne. We have Abdulhakim Hafid. He heads the blockchains laboratory, the Montreal Blockchains Lab at the University of Montreal. We have Katrien Steenmans from Coventry here in the UK, and Tiago Alves from Cardiff. So it's interesting to see that the participants on the panel have different backgrounds. So some in economics, some in computer science. Abdulhakim is very much in networks and computer science. Katrien brings a multidisciplinary perspective, which is wonderful to see. And Tiago, interestingly, is in Earth and Environmental Sciences. He's from the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences, where supply chains and the impact on the environment plays a very, very significant part. And what we will do, as Imtiaz, my colleague, mentioned, is that each of you will be given a couple of minutes to present your thoughts. And Imtiaz has already shared a number of questions with you in terms of questions that you should maybe consider. So how can blockchain technologies enable material reuse? Where do you think the challenges are? And where do you think the benefits are of doing this? What incentivization mechanisms can be used to support reuse, right? So why would people do it, right? So is blockchain really an incentivization mechanism? Very much like this talk that Jason presented, the more we use blockchains, by using blockchains, we actually also enable the use of recyclable use of materials and other products. So does blockchain enable or directly the circular economy, and what type of incentives should these be? So where are the conflicts between regulations such as GDPR in Europe and blockchain, e.g. the right to forget in GDPR and other privacy regulations? Are blockchain technologies suitably robust and scalable, right? So if we really want to apply it to blockchain, apply it to circular supply chains, does the technology really enable this to happen, right? So theoretically, conceptually it does, but how true is this in practice, right? So we have our colleagues from Montreal who have, I'm sure, very nice thoughts on this because they're doing work in scalable blockchain. So we will hear more from them. And can blockchains enhance the traceability in the circular plastic supply chain to drive more recycling, which remains a kind of major technical challenge? So you can see here that the questions stretch across technical aspects, and they also stretch across more economic, legal aspects around the use of blockchains and circular supply chains. So we'll go with this order, if that's okay. So we've just heard a talk from Jason. So Jason, maybe you can just give an overview or your thoughts on these questions in 5 minutes, and then we move on to the next panelist. Please go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Omar. Yeah, so I mean, you've already heard sort of my high-level view of this. I think, and Sinclair Davidson, my colleague, will probably go down the same path. What we're wanting to emphasize was, I think there's an engineering solution to this, but there's an engineering way of thinking about this, and then there's an economics way of thinking about it. And we need to find a way to put those two together. But the economics way of thinking about it is just really emphasizing the idea of an efficient mechanism here. And it's so much of the challenge of creating a circular economy and efficient supply chains and so on is built around the idea that consumers need to be able to make effective choices that where prices and other information is just true. It reflects the full social costs. It reflects the actual information about where things are and then the costs that they impose. So that goal of trying to design supply chain architectures in such a way that information moves from the beginning of it right to the end of it, and consumers at the end can see that and therefore react to that, is a coherent way of approaching the design of, or approaching the need to try and build a circular economy. And the benefit of that design approach is that it kind of happens sort of almost regardless of what governments do. So if good governments that have a lot of regulatory power and are well motivated to try and create a circular economy can help with this, all the better. But it doesn't rely on that. And I think that's the big opportunity that we see in terms of what are the benefits of blockchain supply chains for a circular economy, is that it's actually robust against bad governance. Which interestingly is the same argument you make about cryptocurrencies, is that cryptocurrencies are useful and good and so on, but you don't really need them if you've got high quality government money anyway, but you definitely do if you don't. So that same argument I think carries over. But I'll stay away from the technical side of this until and come back on that perhaps later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. So trust the technology, distrust the government. I like that. I like that thought. So Sinclair Davidson from RMIT Australia. Sinclair, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm going to start off by saying I agree with everything Jason said, and I'm sure he's going to agree with everything that I'm going to say. But I actually want to tell just a slightly different story, riffing off what Jason more or less just said about government failure. If you have a look at climate change problems and environmental degradation and all of these massive social problems that the globe is facing right now, we're actually seeing a massive coordination failure, a government failure. And so I'm kind of thinking, well, let's give the markets a chance. Everybody else has had a go at trying to fix this problem. Let's actually have markets and technology working together to unleash human incentives, to unleash human ingenuity, to actually have a go at solving these particular problems. This is something that so far hasn't really been tried. But again, along with the government failure where we have this massive coordination problem, we also have the same coordination problem in this particular space, in the environmental degradation space. And this problem is due to what economists call missing markets. So what actually happens is that we have a situation whereby goods and services move down a supply chain and then they end up at the final consumer. And we kind of think at this point the supply chain has stopped. But in actual fact, the supply chain continues because we have the waste product, or what currently called waste product, of this good then going into landfill or into waterways or dumped at the side of the road or whatever happens to the waste. Now, what has happened is that this waste is now waste because it cannot be unsold. It cannot be used for some other purpose. And why is that? Because we have a missing market. We don't have the ability to trade that waste with somebody else who may actually value it. This occurs due to high information costs, which, as Jason described, as we move down a supply chain, we have a loss of information. We have a substantial loss of information when that good hits the consumer, because we don't know what's going to happen next. And that loss of information and also a loss of trust leads to a lack of proper pricing. Now, one of the questions is, can blockchain actually work in the situation? Can it incentivize people? And the economics answer to this is yes, it can, because if we can maintain that information flow, if we can embed information within a product as it moves down a supply chain via a blockchain solution, we won't have that loss of information occurring, and we won't have a lack of trust. So once we have got pricing, once we've got the information and we've got the trust, we can have pricing, because without pricing, we cannot properly plan what to do next, and we cannot trade. And as a result, we actually have this waste occurring. Once we have proper pricing, we will be able to plan, we will be able to trade, we will be able to make better use of what is currently becoming waste. And blockchain is the solution to this problem for precisely the reasons which Jason set out in the first 15 minutes or so of his talk. The idea of a ledger keeping track of information, reliably keeping track of information. So once we have proper pricing, we have the technology, and I'm kind of thinking if we actually allow human ingenuity to actually have a go at solving these problems, we will actually be able to solve coordination problems, which so far the political process and the bureaucratic processes have failed to do. So I think I'll leave it at that and happy to answer
Fantastic.
questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinclair. So we'll come back to the, so essentially that's a very interesting proposition, right? That I guess that the circus of the blockchains as an enabler for a market economy where information is provided or enough information is available that will facilitate reuse, and the information that is recorded in a ledger that cannot be modified, and therefore facilitates a economic market economy behind reuse. Because unless you incentivize people with money, you know, there may be lots of social and reasons for reuse, but money, you know, makes the world go round, right? So
Yes,
as I say,
absolutely.
okay, great, perfect, very interesting thought. So we'll move over to Abdulhakim. So let's bring in the geeks. Hi, Abdulhakim. So Abdulhakim has a very interesting background. He came to Montreal from industry, from Nortel Networks. So very interesting to see the tech side. Go ahead, Abdulhakim.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so I'll be talking about scalability because scalability is one of the key issues of blockchain. And as you know, if you think about Bitcoin and Ethereum, the number of transactions per second is too small. 7 transactions per second, 14 transactions per second. So there are lots of research going on, and also industry trying to increase the throughput. And there are some interesting solutions that can bring us throughput of the several thousands transactions per second and so on. So there are lots of things going on. However, there is no one solution for everything. And this is, we need to expect that. So there will be no one blockchain for everything, because some solution like Solana, if you did hear about Solana, so they are trying to solve this problem, and they are trying to be the blockchain of everything. And in my opinion, there will not be only one blockchain. There will be lots of blockchains, and it's up to us to decide, because I believe in the future we'll have lots of blockchains, and some blockchains can be very specific to some industry segments. Some of them can be specific to some geographical location. And also, we should not only worry about scalability, we should also worry about the cost, because the cost is very, very important. You want to support like the supply chain. I'm not supply chain expert, but I'm assuming the transaction should be very, very cheap if you want people get involved in the supply chain process, and they need to send transactions to the blockchain because each transaction costs. For example, now in Ethereum, for a very, very simple transaction, it may cost you $100, $100 US. Now, even the Avalanche, the new scalable blockchain, I mean, in the 3rd or 4th week of November, very simple transaction was costing $20 US. So here we have to do 2 things. I mean, the first thing is the scalability. The second is the cost. But there is another way of solving the problem. So we have the blockchain. So this is the basic blockchain protocol. And then what we can do, we can build what we call second layer solution. So we can build very cheap, very scalable solution that rely on the first layer solution. For example, I'll give you an example. For example, when we are talking about Bitcoin transaction is expensive and it takes too much time. But there is solution, what we call the Lightning Network. It's cheaper and it's more scalable. So the future, what I see, I mean, in the future of blockchain, we'll be using some very scalable first layer solution that will be building our own solution, for example, for the supply chain, a second layer solution that will take benefits from the first layer, which is scalable, but the second layer, which will be more scalable and cheap in terms of costs. And in terms of incentives, I think the blockchain can be very good for incentives for participants in the supply chain, because with the token concept, so we can, for example, have some type of token to reward people involved in this supply chain, in this recycling. So to conclude, there is a lot of things going on. We have to think, I mean, we have to think about the scalability, but also the cost. Very, very important, because I can have scalable blockchain, but if you have to pay high cost for transaction, it will not work. So we need a cheap transaction, almost free. I will not say free, but almost very, very cheap, scalable. The future is that we will not have one solution. We'll have several blockchain platforms and build on those platforms for specific application or industry segments or geographical locations.
Thank you, Abdulhakim, for very interesting thoughts. So I think the idea of, you're absolutely right, because in many of the existing blockchain models, the rich get richer because of proof of work, which is one of the key consensus mechanisms, used. So if you're a big miner, so the rich get richer and the rich use more energy, where the poor cannot use blockchains at all. So in terms of scaling blockchains, with things like IOTA and Hedera Hashgraph and equivalent kind of blockchains, which are in many ways trying to scale up blockchains. And as you said, right, that the concept of multiple layers of blockchains, like the Lightning Network, alongside Bitcoin and stuff,
yeah.
And the idea of having what if I maybe exactly say in another word is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this ability to have customized blockchains, particularly focused on circular supply chains. So don't use something out of the box, but try to identify how these multiple layers of blockchains can coexist, particularly to support circular supply chains. And what would that mean for transaction costs and the cost of entry for players? Because again, it's not just about enabling people to use that for the benefit they provide, but also reducing the cost of entry in terms of the use of the infrastructure. Yep. So fascinating discussion. I think we'll pick these up questions later on. And I'm really pleased to get Katrien Steenmans from Coventry University. Coventry is I'm an external examiner, by the way, at Coventry, Katrien, so a very interesting institution in the UK with lots and lots of industry engagement in the particular area that they are operating in. So really love to hear more of your thoughts, Katrien.
Hi, thank you. I'd also like to point out my background as an environmental law. So my focus has really been in my research on circular economies as the starting point. And so the question that I'm generally interested in is how blockchain technology can support waste laws promoting circular economies. So I've come from the angle of we'd like a circular economy and what sort of mechanisms can help with that. And in my opinion, in and of itself, blockchain technology isn't necessarily an enabler for material reuse, recycling, and recovery, but it's the fact that it can provide the information, which means that there are examples that exist where it's being used to support this recycling, recovery, and reuse. But often it's in conjunction with other existing sensors that are needed to help gather this information. But as one of my collaborators often says that I work with is he's always, well, blockchain isn't necessary. It could just be another database. It's just, this is the database often of choice at the minute, and a buzzword, as Professor Moranis pointed out in his opening remarks to the workshop a few hours ago. It's also important to keep in mind that we need to keep taking a step back when we're thinking about the circular economy, about what the problem is in the first place, which is the overconsumption of resources, and using that as our starting point, rather than already looking ahead at solutions. And so the main way that I have seen blockchain used as an enabler to support regulation is the fact that it does garner attention for these initiatives. So the actual role that initiatives so far have had in supporting laws has been quite limited, but it's the fact that it's not the recycling or the recovery that's getting the attention, it's the fact that blockchain is being used, and in that way it is an enabler in some of these initiatives that use blockchain technology to facilitate more minor scale circular economies. And also from a regulatory point of view, and this was mentioned in the keynote, it's the fact that blockchain can reliably keep track of information, which can help facilitate regulatory compliance. For this, though, we need effective waste laws in place in the first place. And this is where I still think in my research, there are big gaps at the moment. So there's numerous examples and mechanisms being implemented where there's a role for blockchain, such as extended producer responsibility and the right to repair. But these mechanisms are still very flawed in themselves, that at this stage, it would almost be a bit premature to use blockchain technology to support these mechanisms, because the implementation of the mechanisms themselves have too many gaps still, in my opinion, that is. Yeah, so my key high-level takeaway really is that there's other issues with the regulatory framework surrounding circular economies and incentivizing the waste prevention and more reuse and recycling before we can really look at blockchain technology in detail.
That's a fascinating thought, Katrien. Thank you so much. So I think that's a very interesting thought. Maybe we can pick it up in the conversation that, if a blockchain is an enabler for something else, for example, that if a blockchain facilitates, the legal compliance, and does the relevant legislation exist on the legal side for which you're actually trying to use blockchain for? This goes back to actually a very interesting, fascinating observation. Also, if I look back in computer security, and probably Abdulhakim can, also pick this up later, that in the Computer Misuse Act, which was in the UK in particular, the question was that, although we had Computer Misuse Act, but very few people were actually, prosecuted using the Computer Misuse Act, because the evidence needed to actually take them to court and to actually go and, that was never there, and it was very hard to collect the evidence. So although the legislation was there, but in order for you to collect the relevant data to enact that legislation was also very limited. I think the question is, we could end up in a similar situation where, we use blockchains to actually create a ledger which is immutable and cannot be modified by anybody. And then when we actually try to enact the laws to support reuse, and as you said, the management of e-waste, actually, the laws are not there to enable that to happen. So I think we need both sides to operate in sync. And that's a fascinating, maybe we can pick that up also later. So I'd like to invite the last panelist, and then I'll pass over to my colleague Tiago for some of the questions. Is my colleague from Cardiff, Tiago Alves, from the School of Environmental and Earth Sciences at Cardiff University. Go ahead, Tiago.
Thank you, Omer. It's an interesting discussion, and it's actually something that environmental scientists don't really deal with, blockchains. But I would like to share actually what is our opinion in terms of especially what I do, marine pollution and pollution coming from point sources like rivers. We call those rivers point sources of pollution. We've had a couple of projects on the Mediterranean basin. And someone mentioned scalability and also traceability. And we feel that actually those are two main problems that in terms of environmental impact of litter and of pollution, we feel that they are more urgent, and where actually blockchains can help us in that matter. I'm going to give you some examples. So I've dealt many years ago. I've met a person who was doing was recycling oil rigs in Angola. So old oil rigs have everything from metal to uranium, to vanadium, to minerals that can be recycled in places like China, Pakistan, India. And there was only one person actually selling the oil rig and losing completely the trace of those of the same materials that he was intending to recycle. So that's the reason why, for example, blockchain can actually allow us to understand where those resources are going and in which country they're going to end up. The other one is the question that there is pollution from medium-sized activities like agriculture, like tourism in some countries, and there is the consumer like us that sometimes pollutes when they don't want, right, and when they don't understand. And while the while some people and some companies around Europe collect some of the plastics, some of the pollutants, and export them to places like Germany. Again, there is an issue with traceability, how much you export where, what you do with those products. But also some countries are trying to, not with Bitcoin, not with cryptocurrencies, but they are trying to implement systems in which you pay something to people who want to recycle, who want to contribute to the circular economy. So there are cities in Europe in which you've got stations in which you can put cans, plastic bottles, any other types of materials, and actually those stations, which are electronic, give you some money back. So I wonder if you can do that with, I don't know, with apps on your mobiles, with some kind of system that will allow you to reward the people who want to contribute to a circular economy or to a more circular economy on the spot, with awards, with, let's say, credit for a coffee, let's say, or credit for something that you want to buy in a normal shop. I think that that is starting to appear in Europe in some countries, but the technology is not there to apply yet or to implement blockchain technologies or blockchain options for the common citizen. But I think it's going to come. It's going to appear at some point.
Okay, no, that's fantastic. So basically a cryptocurrency, I can see behind Sinclair, crypto economics. So cryptocurrency that particularly facilitates reuse. So the idea is you have these virtual tokens, and the more you reuse, the more you accrue these tokens. And the question would be then that the incentive mechanism is that you have a kind of a virtual currency to facilitate reuse. I think that's an interesting idea, right? So
yeah, I think
and also allow different materials to be traceable in a way that they're not wasted. So you export in bulk some materials to be recycled, but you're sure that 100% of what you export is going to end up in the correct place, which probably doesn't happen yet.
Abdulhakim, you had a comment? Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, I think the concept of tokens can be used to reward people involved in this, and those tokens also can be supported or sponsored by companies or by individuals who want to help in this work. And it's very, very good, and it has been used. I mean, in the past, not in the environments, in other stuff. I mean, you do something, and we'll give you those tokens, and you can use those tokens to do something. And the tokens have value if there is interest in those tokens. And this is one of the best way to as incentives for people to get involved. You need to give them something to get them involved. And also, I will add to Katrien. I mean, yes. I mean, this is a big issue because I'm working in projects with the law school at the University of Montreal and with some people in Netherlands, faculty from Netherlands, the US. And what we are trying to do, how to implement legal solutions using blockchain. And there are lots of issues because there are some legislation that you cannot write as a code. So it's big projects, 5 years projects, and we are trying to see what types of laws can we encode as smart contracts. And it's difficult because some legislation you cannot really write it as a code because there are something in the contract that you cannot write as a code. So it's very, very interesting problem.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the question often is that legislation is often interpretable in different ways. Legislation, mapping legislation to logical rules, like GDPR, for example, is often very challenging because after all, it's the lawyers who interpret legislation based on the context of use, and directly mapping legislation and legal clauses into a completely computer interpretable form remains a challenge. But I think that's very interesting. So what you're saying is really that blockchains can enable a virtual currency that could be used as a token for facilitating the use. Sorry, Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add some nuance and color to that thought. I think it is a clear possibility that we could create a new type of circular economy coin that is funded in some way. Let's ignore how that's funded, but then provides an incentive mechanism for people to do the thing. I think the argument that I was making and Sinclair was making as well is that the starting point here isn't that you need to incentivize people to do the thing. People already want to do the thing. Now, maybe not everyone, but the presumption here is that people want to live in a good world, in a world that has environment. They already have sort of environmental preferences and values they're trying to support. The challenge is it's hard to do that because I can't see in prices, if I'm just shopping out there, I can't see the full circular economy impact of everything that I'm doing in prices. And there's a difference between get the prices right, which was the point that Sinclair was making around, if I can see the full environmental cost of the thing in front of me in prices, then I can make a rational decision about that. And I think the argument that we were making here is that you don't actually have to incentivize people to do something they don't want to do. They already want to do this. We just need to provide them with the information, the true information, the trusted information that they can do that. And crucially, that information has to work at global scale. These have to be markets and prices that don't just sit in Australia or sit in the UK. Those prices have to, that information and prices has to follow the good wherever it is on the full supply chain. And that's a hard problem. But the presumption, so I think there's two solutions here. There is a token to incentivize people to do the thing. And then there's the better information and prices to allow people to do the thing. Now, those are complementary. We could, to power this up, we do both at once. But we don't need to, I think the argument is actually that these are two separate problems. The other point to make here is that the reason that I think we're sort of a little bit skeptical of a legislative regulatory approach to this is that while that usually works well in a country or even a group of countries as big as the EU, it doesn't work at all at a global scale. Just simply because legislation is written and enacted and enforced by a national government and the courts and so on that do that. And here in Australia, we're law-abiding citizens. We all obey the law and follow it. But it's Australian law doesn't apply anywhere else. So in order to make Australian law apply somewhere else, we have to have high-level treaty agreements with every counterparty. Now, we can do that through trade treaties, and we can get the WTO involved in this, and we can negotiate, and 27 years later, we'll get somewhere, best case scenario, at extremely high cost. So I think that it's not the case that that isn't a solution. It's just it's a slow, high-cost solution that, I think, from Australia, it just looks like a weaker solution than it does from the EU's perspective, where most of your market is within the legal jurisdictional zone that you're sort of working within. So I think that nuance to that point. It's not the case that there's we've got a bunch of different solutions, all of which involve this technology. But I think we'd distinguish between the ones that are enable people to do the things that they want to do anyway, just with better prices. And I think that's the fastest approach. Mm-hmm. Then we can power that up with a tokenized incentive mechanism. And again, I put aside how we fund that, but maybe charity, maybe public funds and so on. But and then we back that up with legislation in a country. But the hardest problem of all is global legislation. And I think this is just simply an end run around that gets us to a point faster. Even though we all share the same goals here. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jason. So over to you, Imtiaz. Go ahead. Imtiaz, you're on mute. Sorry.
I mean, based on this, Jason's understanding about this globalization of legislation, I mean, that's obviously a very difficult task. In terms of tokenization, incentivization through tokens, that would that also needs to be kind of globalized? I mean, so that I can use that token across the globe, or does it, I mean, benefit or it has some value on the incentivization? So if the token is only valuable or used at local level, right, but I cannot use it in a global scale, would that kind of add value to the incentivization process?
So if I could answer that question, I think the point was made before is that there isn't going to be one blockchain. There isn't going to be one token to rule them all. There's actually going to be competition in this particular space. And the kind of world that I'm imagining is that there will be multiple circular economy blockchains operating for perhaps different products across different areas. But one of the nice things about blockchain technology is that it is born global. You can use it anywhere where you have an internet connection. You can have that token anywhere where you have an internet connection. What you have to worry about are local regulations preventing you from actually accessing that blockchain or accessing that token. So if a country comes along and suddenly bans the circular economy token, that's a problem. So the role that I see for regulation here isn't so much forcing people to do things, because that's got huge compliance costs and not everybody wants to do it and what have you, but everybody's always very enthusiastic to make money or very enthusiastic to get a token. And so you actually go from that sort of from the stick to the carrot kind of approach here. So I would imagine there would be multiple chains, there'd be multiple tokens, and as long as people actually value those tokens or are willing to trade those tokens, we will see those incentive effects coming through. I'm actually quite optimistic that once people start building specific business models, and they will have to be specific business models to make this work, that we'll see a lot of uptake, a lot of a lot of participation. And the role of government is to come along and say, yes, we're recognizing you doing that. We're not going to stop you from doing that. And that goes towards regulations, towards recognition of cryptocurrencies, modifying taxation of cryptocurrencies, legal personality for DAOs. That's where I see the regulatory process actually coming in and being important. Not saying to people, you've got to have 10 recycling bins now, because everybody grumbles and they're upset and they're annoyed and what have you, and they don't really comply properly. And we actually miss the end goal. The end goal here is actually to live in a cleaner world where we can encourage human flourishing. That's the story, and I think everybody wants to get there, and we need to stop looking towards governments and bureaucrats to deliver that world, because they're kind of failing. Sorry, I don't want to upset anybody, but they are failing.
On that
Yeah,
note, okay, sorry, go ahead, Imtiaz.
Yeah, because I mean, Katrien was talking about this uncertainty, like if legislation kind of from particular government kind of block the use of that coin suddenly, that the whole transaction and incentivization structure can be kind of almost like vanish, right? Because there will be no incentivization. So there is a degree of uncertainty. So how to, and obviously legislation is the core bottleneck for this uncertainty, or the fueling this uncertainty. So how to kind of balance this uncertainty and incentivization. So that we are discussing.
Yeah, I will add to this. I mean, banning the token is, I mean, yeah, it's kind of problem, but you still have the token and you can use it elsewhere. You can buy something with it elsewhere. So this is the thing. Yeah, Australia bans the token, okay, but they have my token is in the blockchain and they can use it, and I can exchange it with some other token that is acceptable by Australia. So I don't think that this is an issue, in my opinion. Yeah, it's kind of, but it's not an issue, in my opinion.
So I think if you look at the NFT market recently, with works of art, if you go to OpenSea.ai or any of these existing markets for NFT products, the idea that they have, you can now sell NFTs for Ethereum, you can use Polygon. So Polygon is this new blockchain system from India, which is actually a multi-layered blockchain where your transaction costs are actually very low. I think, if NFTs can do it, why can't circular economy tokens? Why can't circular economy tokens be traded like NFTs?
In my opinion, I mean, the use of token, I mean, it will be very, very interesting, and it will big push for this process.
Okay.
People like
I'm just gonna.
softness.
Okay, that's very. I'm just gonna throw a use case, Imtiaz, if possible. I think we're moved too much. We steered too much towards legislation, and so I'm just gonna throw a use case at you guys and see what you. So suppose we have a construction use case, right? So suppose I have a building. Here we all know what buildings are, and in the construction supply chain, UK companies like Arup and Costain and HS2 is another example. So we have one person in the audience, Ken. She gave a very interesting talk. So suppose you have a building, and when you create a building, the building goes through a life cycle. So you create a building, you bring in the different engineers, you create a BIM model often of a building information model, and then it's given to facilities managers. So facilities managers, they put in the carpets and they manage the building. And finally, if the building is to be repurposed, or alternatively, if the building is going to be taken down, the question is, wouldn't it be nice, right, at the point at which I create the building, to associate a reusability index with the building? So suppose I have materials like steel, for example, or which have very long lifetimes. So rather than go and make more steel, why don't I just reuse the steel that comes out of the building at the end of its life cycle? So my question is, that the construction industry has a very big supply chain, and it also has a very strong impact on the economy because it employs so many people, and it has a. So how could we make this so just focusing on this particular industry specifically, what are your thoughts on making the construction industry more reusable, and how would you do it? What were the technologies and legislation economics factors behind it? Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, so like I'll just speak to one aspect of this, the economic incentive aspect. So we've been thinking quite hard about this, and actually been working with some startups who are trying to solve exactly this problem around basically digital twins for buildings and the question of what goes on there. The basic economic problem is the incentive problem to put the information out, because I build the building, I've got a digital twin of the building, that information is valuable to me, it's valuable to others. But if I hold it, I can charge access to that information because it's valuable to others. The question is the property rights over that information. And at the moment, we've seen some just incredible examples of poorly defined property rights where those records just disappeared because no one owned them and it wasn't clear who owned them once the buildings were sold. And so you have this sort of lost registry problem. That was a missing property rights problem. The just as bad problem is that I own this, and because anyone who does any maintenance on this building needs this information and there are no substitutes, I've now got a monopoly information problem where I can charge you whatever I like for the access to the information, and you need it. You can't do anything with this building without this information. So that's a situation where we normally solve that type of problem with a kind of quasi-regulation. We require access or joint ownership. But I think just appreciating the incentive problem around ownership of that information is real. It's important. We didn't solve it in the past, which is why we've got the problem right now. Maybe we can solve it going forward. It's not obvious to me whether the problem is separate the property rights. There's ownership of the building, there's ownership of the information about the building, and that is best held by different people. Or the same people. I don't know. Maybe we need to. I don't know. But there's a lot of the problems that we've seen with this space have just simply been around. It wasn't clear who owned the information, therefore who had access control to the information, and anyone who did get that information could exploit others terribly with it. So there's a way of looking at that as an economic problem over and above and beyond what is the technical solution to this.
Go ahead, Imtiaz.
Yeah, so I wanted to add something on this. If it is like because in building materials are physical material, you can not easily, but you can tag it with some sort of tagging system and stuff like that. But what if it is like biological products or agricultural products, right? Crops or poultry or fisheries and something like that, which are difficult to tag, as well as it goes to the reuse and stuff like that. Is it in terms of technological perspective, how easy or difficult it is to kind of putting into tagging system and putting into the circular economy. And secondly, how, again, in terms of incentivization mechanism, what would be the route or something like that?
So we've been thinking about, in answer to exactly that problem, thinking about a category of goods that we are going to start labeling Satoshi goods. So you actually very often have a lot of information that is completely lost when a product is manufactured. Now think, for example, of honey. Now, a lot of people think, honey is kind of homogenous and all this sort of stuff, but in actual fact, where the bees were, what sort of plants they came from, was it a rainy day, was it a sunny day, had there been unusual weather patterns, all this sort of stuff actually ends up in the taste of the honey. And some honey producers actually try to emphasize those sorts of things. So the solution, the kind of thing is to think of honey as being a vector of characteristics. So yes, it's honey, it's got this viscosity, it was made by those bees on this day, eating those plants, or pollen from the plants and what have you. And in that way, you would need to create a digital twin. Now, at the moment, everybody thinks of NFTs as being, artworks. But in actual fact, I'm starting to think of NFTs as being like the future workhorse of the economy, because these are going to be the digital twins, the descriptors of a good or service. And so these Satoshi goods are going to have to be where not just general information, because if you're making petrol, for example, or diesel or oil or what have you, it's more or less always going to be very similar. You can put it through a chemical process and reverse out what it is. But for some biological goods, honey and what have you, you actually can't. So you're going to have to be able to create these digital twins and write these twins to a chain and then tag the good. Now, Katrien made a very important point earlier on, is that blockchain by itself isn't actually going to be the story. You're actually going to have the Internet of Things. We are going to have oracles. We are going to have things that point from the real world to blockchains. Mm-hmm. And when you have that complementary technology around the system, we are going to be able to do these sorts of things. And in future, we may be able to price and pay for these sorts of things. So if I'm a consumer who wants to have honey made from bees pollinated by sunflowers, I'm going to pay extra for that. Or other people may actually, they're not going to care. So it may well be that you will have pricing of the underlying product and second different pricing for the digital twin. But all of that is adding more and more information into the system, which is immutable and which is observable and which is trustless. So the ability to enhance the real world with additional information is actually going to be the game changer here.
Yeah, Sinclair, I will add this because when you talk to oracles, this is a big issue, because when we are talking about people, we call them human oracles. So they will put this information, we need to trust them. Somebody else will write this information about honey and try to sell it as this honey that is the expensive one. And here we did some research about this, and the thing for each product, you have really to find a way how to make sure that you will the tag, the IoT, so you will tag this honey with some tag that cannot be compromised. So if somebody wants to take this tag and put it in some mediocre honey, he can't, because he has, for example, and there is a case for wine. There is a company that they are trying to do this for wine. So if you want to get this tag, you have really to open up the bottle and stuff. So each case really needs some research and how really to make sure that it cannot be compromised during the transport from the source to the destination.
Very fascinating. So just before I bring in Tiago, and so I think this reminds me of work in provenance and provenance tracking, because if I look at food products, so in the UK, we had this horse meat scare where the horse meat was, embedded into the supply chain. And of course, as you mentioned, wines and other kind of products, the provenance plays a very important part, because the value of, especially in the food sector and the food area, the provenance of a product, although it has applied to art in particular, but I think provenance of food has been major thing in European markets, European legislation also. So yeah, very,
same
very
thing.
interesting. Sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
The same thing for
Abdulhakim and then Tiago.
for pharmaceutical companies and all of them. And the IoT is a big problem because when you, for example, you want to transport meat under certain temperature, you have to make sure that, I mean, so you have sensor in this truck, but you have to make sure that the sensor is inside this truck and not somewhere else. So you have to make sure that it's the sensor is authenticated, but also in the physical place where it should be, not in the cabin of the driver. So there are a lot of issues. We did some research about this, and it's not easy, but lots of research going on, and there are some startups trying to solve those issues.
Fantastic. Tiago, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going back to your question about the construction materials and how can you recycle them and reuse them. I just wondered if actually your analog is in the aviation industry, because they basically standardize airplanes. They're basically two big companies that produce pretty much the same airplane. So they're just variations of the same model that they had agreed on 20 or 30 years ago. And also, they're not builders, but the pilots also, when they are trained for one model, they can pilot the other models as well. So I wonder if that's basically your analog, because in the aviation industry managed to somehow standardize the materials that they use in airplanes and standardize in a way that you can actually use pieces of one airplane to another airplane. And maybe you can use eventually pieces of or parts of a building on the building of the same model or the same type in the future if you standardize the construction materials that way. Of course,
That's
like with airplanes, there's degradation of the materials coming out in the equation and making things a little bit more complicated. But
actually, that's a very good point, Diego. So in fact, the provenance trail of an aircraft. So for example, when Airbus creates an Airbus, so we're actually working on a project on provenance a couple of years ago with German Aerospace. So when German Aerospace or because Airbus is a collection of companies, it's not a single company. And when they sell an aircraft, you have to maintain the record for 99 years of all the maintenance that happened on that aircraft. Because when you sell an aircraft to a third party, the provenance trail is often kept. Because if a defect occurs, you don't know if the defect was because of pilot error, or it was due to a faulty part, or it was due to bad maintenance. So, we're safety critical systems, especially with safety critical systems, provenance has been there for a long time. And I think maybe we can learn from the way they do it in terms of exactly, as you said, the standardization that these safety critical industries have done in the past, and maybe bring that to the blockchain world. I think that's a very, very interesting. So I just wanted to pick up on one other question, guys, if I may. Okay, so suppose we record everything, right? Okay, so let's be a computer scientist and say I record everything, because the more information I record, because I might not know what I might need. Where do you put all this stuff? Where do you store all this stuff? Because eventually the blockchain becomes so big, so the question is, how do you, who maintains it? Who pays for the data storage? Who pays for the maintenance of that storage? Imagine you have a blockchain where the blockchain is fragmented because I just can't put it in one data center. So it's physically fragmented. And one of the data center crashes or goes out of business. What happens to the blockchain? So how do you store this stuff? I wonder what your thoughts are. I'll start with Abdulhakim because you're the geek here. I'm sorry. And then maybe we can move to Katrien and Imtiaz also. So.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I mean, at least this is the way to go, because you cannot keep the whole blockchain. Like, for example, for Bitcoin now, you are keeping the whole blockchain. But transactions are, I mean, it's not much. You are just transferring tokens. That's when you are talking about this kind of thing. Definitively, the data or the should not be stored in the blockchain. I mean, the big data, it should be off-chain. And one of the things that you can do, you can also store it in decentralized way. You should not keep it in one single copy. And there are some startup I'm working on with them in the US. They are talking about archives. So you have the blockchain working all those transactions, and there are some archives which are decentralized too. So you don't have only one copy of the blockchain. And for example, today, I mean, if you want to do this, for example, with Ethereum, you will just use IPFS. It's decentralized storage because anyway, the future will not have those centralized cloud and stuff. There are lots of startups and research going on for decentralized storage. So you decentralize will be using all the machines in the world that have some available storage, and then we'll be storing this information or this blockchain data. We'll be storing this, but in decentralized manner. So we'll not rely only on one node. So if it's in a node or crashes, we'll have a copy somewhere else. So the way to go is decentralized storage.
My question to you, Abdulhakim, is, suppose 50, 100 years from now, while we're on Mars, right, and we have a station on Mars, and some guy walks into Earth and tries to excavate a blockchain record, and they cannot find parts of it because parts of it is missing because Facebook no longer exists, right? Or some Google provider doesn't exist. How can they reconstruct a blockchain if maybe 80% of this doesn't exist anymore because we just don't have the place to put it? So I guess, I wonder what does that mean, right? So is a blockchain, because once again, right, is a blockchain a limitation in some way because maybe we rely too much and we think it's a solution to many problems when technically there are serious significant challenges underneath it? I wonder what you think, guys. Maybe we can start with Katrien and then we come to you, Jason. So Katrien, any thoughts?
Yeah, not so much on the technical side because that's beyond my expertise, but it's that issue that you've alluded to as well about the amount of information that can be put on the blockchain and ensuring it's useful and usable to people. So identifying what the purposes of the information, who the users are, just to ensure that, yes, we can keep collecting all the data, but what's it for really? Yeah, so that would be one of my questions. And then again, also the issue of standardization that's come up. There may be a lot of information collected, but even if it's just assigning labels, it's, do we have a standard definition for those labels? Even when we look within the EU, which is my area of expertise, waste, even though there's a definition, there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty still with the definition of waste, for example. So if we're putting something on the blockchain saying this is waste, how can we be sure that there's waste? There's those sort of obstacles as well to recording information.
Very good. So Abdulhakim, I'll just come to you. Jason, you had your hand up before.
Yeah, thank you.
Any comments? And then
yeah, just to sort of, and again, just to speak as an economist to one aspect of this point, we're thinking of, I mean, the economics of this is quite clear. Whoever values the resource should pay for the resource, right? And the problem, though, is I might not know who values it for 100 years. And it might be we need that information now to be recorded because someone in 100 years' time needs that, and then, but I can't charge them, right? So that's why this is a hard economic problem. One solution is we make it a public good. We just go, look, we write the information down. We don't know who's going to value it. Someone will, but we're doing it for them or for our future. But the key point about that is that the idea of the information as administrative records for future safety purposes, that we can imagine that purpose. That's one use of that information, to deal with safety issues in the future for, we don't know who, but maybe someone. But the thing about data is it's a non-rival good. I can use it for that purpose, and I can also use it for another purpose, and it still works for that purpose. So I need to take that administrative good and turn it into an economic good. In economics, this is called a tied good, where something is multiple things simultaneously. So that digital twin, that's information about the structure of the wing or the shape of the building or the materials that are in it, is also information that other architects might want for reasons, or other potential buyers of a building might want for reasons. It's not just for so there are potentially multiple consumers of that information. And that sort of points the way to the idea of how do we, how do we store it and who pays for that storage? Is the more we can turn that data into an economic good and create a market for it, the more we've incentivized some entrepreneur to raise finance to store the information. And just as we do with all other goods. So, and again, just, I'm aware we're sort of driving a point, over and over again here that, more markets, but it does feel like that is a class of solution that blockchains open up, is just to create things that aren't naturally economic goods, data, and turn them into economic goods. And then sometimes we get benefits from doing that. And I think who pays for the storage is actually one possibility here.
Great, thank you. Abdulhakim?
No, I think I'm joining Jason on this, because what I was to say is that at a given time, if the information is kind of doesn't have a use, so we'll just get rid of it. Because I was thinking, because we had this discussion with this startup working on archives, because like in bank you have transaction, but you cannot go and ask them to give you a transaction that you did 20 years ago. I think they have 5 years or 10 years, and they will get rid of this data. So the same concept will be used. If there is no use, and as Jason said, there is no money to be made, or somebody need it, maybe sometimes you have to prune this data because it's useless. For example, who will be interested on the transaction that I did on Bitcoin 50 years from now?
Who knows? So that's the question, right? So the question is, do we need a compression format for blockchains, which is specifically applicable to blockchains? So like we have encryption and compression for video, we have encryption and compression for different types of data formats. Do we need an equivalent effort in blockchain technologies to manage the storage and maintain them for longer periods?
Yeah, and I read somewhere there will be some DNA storage. I don't know, it's science fiction. Did you hear about it? And you can store, I don't know how much in those small, what's they call DNA storage. I just read about it somewhere. I don't know if you did hear about it. So if we have it, so we will not have this issue.
Interesting. Imtiaz, you had a question. Sorry, go ahead, Imtiaz.
Yeah, I mean, about this, I mean, in terms of like information completeness, right? So can we add value to that, right? So if someone produce information that is complete compared to other person that is not information, is semi-complete, or quality is not good. So can we make some sort of variable competitiveness according on information completeness as well as the quality of information? How that will impact the waste management, I mean, the circular economy.
Okay, so if I understand that correctly, Imtiaz, so it's basically saying what information is absolutely necessary to facilitate the circular economy, and what would be nice to have, right? What is the core?
Yeah, core, as well as like, I mean, say for example, any type of like simple linear supply chain. I mean, if some actors are producing a complete information, right? What they're supposed to do, whereas other actor on that same level are not producing the completeness of the information, right? So how, it's not incentivization, it's just how we can kind of differentiate economic benefit to them. I mean, more as like a competitive open market kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I think that goes back to, what is, it's going back to the standards idea, right? What standardization is necessary. So is there a core subset that everybody should have? And then something that could sit around it as it would be a nice to have element. So
yeah, because
Sinclair,
I mean, all information will not come.
Sorry, no, you go. I'll respond after you.
Because all information will come from the machine, right? So some are coming from like a human input data, as well as Abdulhakim was saying that whether the temperature gauges were placed inside the truck or inside the cab of the driver or some things like that. So that will have quality on the information, right? As well as completeness of the information. So how you can kind of gauge that in terms of economics.
So if I could just pick up, it's on that point. I'm not actually going to respond directly to your comment because I don't know. But one of the things that we haven't really touched on, we've got a blockchain technology, we've got economic incentives. Jason and I have been hammering on about the need for markets all along. But we also need to recognize that these things are actually just tools. And the one thing that is missing that we haven't really touched on is you need to build viable business models with these tools whereby people can actually achieve some sort of outcome and can achieve some sort of goal. So before we were talking about, say, how expensive transactions are on some blockchains. That's a congestion problem. And that's it's horrific when you are paying those fees, but that's a nice problem to have because the market is signaling to you that we need more capacity on some particular chains, and other chains come along and compete and offer lower services. And the same with if storage problems start becoming horrific and become expensive, that'll actually then unleash human ingenuity, come up with a solution to this particular storage problem, find a cheaper way of doing it. So when you have markets and you have technologies and you have smart people and what have you, we need to bring them all together to come up with business models. And a lot of what Jason and I do in our industry engagement work and outreach work is actually work with entrepreneurs. They come along and they say, I've got an idea for this. And what we do is we work with them to come up with a business model whereby all these tools fit together and it works. And that's what's going to have to happen in the circular economy space, is that people are going to have to pick up these tools, see what they are, discover the opportunities, and then come up with a business model, because we've got a technology. And there are, of course, multiple competing technologies, and they all have to fit together. I mean, I think that's a good point. And we have economic incentives, which we can recognize and see, and we've got markets, but it actually takes a lot of careful work to look into a particular supply chain, look into a particular product. The kinds of information that you're going to need for this, the construction industry, are going to be subtly different to the kinds of information you need for the airline industry. You know, it's a similar class of problem, but when you get into the gory detail, it's going to be a different problem. There's going to be different ways of doing things and how they're going to be doing, and where people can make money and where you pay out a token and where people can charge a fee, and all these things are going to differ. So it's actually going to be multiple supply chain solutions, and in some of them we're going to have a lot more information. I mean, you know exactly everything that goes into an aeroplane. Well, I hope you do. You might not know exactly everything that goes into a building, you know, and so on, you know. So it's going to be in some areas where you need more information, it'll be priced, it'll be more expensive, it'll be more valuable there. And, you know, so it's going to take a lot of work moving through product line by product line, industry by industry. This is going to keep a lot of people out of mischief for a long time, working on solving a lot of these very complicated problems before we even get to the, gee, we are now collecting a zillion times more data than we were before. But that problem too will send out a price signal, and smart people will come up with solutions as they have. And I'm always guided by, I think it was Bill Gates who said, is that we overestimate what's going to happen in the next 2 years, and we underestimate what's going to happen in the next 10 years. And I think that is very much the case of what's happening here.
No, I think that sounds really good. Absolutely. I think economics plays a very important part. And I'll come back to one question on this, because if blockchains are so important, should taxpayers pay for it? Because if they're so important, just like, you know, the question that we were asking a couple of years ago, and I'm sure Abdulhakim has a comment on this, you know, if computer networks and data connectivity is so important, we should never have to pay for broadband, because it should be paid through taxpayers' money. But I'll just come back to Tiago for 1 second, if I may. So Tiago, you're the end user here, right? Because you're the environmental scientist, right? We're all trying to convince in terms of, so I pick up on Jason's comment on trust, you know, because how do environmental scientists see blockchains? Do they see this as, another new technological hype along the Gartner hype curve, or do they really see benefit in the use of these technologies?
Good question. I mean, I've dealt with computer scientists in some projects with
Sorry.
and they are very aware of blockchains and especially cryptocurrencies and the use of IT technology, so information technology to help environmental problems. I've seen it especially in medicine. So the people I worked with, they do use IT solutions for medical problems. I think you're touching an interesting point. The normal environmental scientist maybe is aware at 0.1% aware that blockchains occur or exist in the world, right? So there should be some effort to make blockchains more known to environmental scientists, definitely.
It's more show and tell. I think maybe we want more scenarios of use and examples of use, just like that. Sinclair also picked up on economics.
Economics, that's the thing. The environmental scientists who deal with economic issues and economic problems probably are aware of blockchains as a solution or a tool. Others don't. The ones that probably are in the field or in doing the non-economic or not so much related to the economic part of things will be not aware of blockchains. Having said that, I go back to the app. I mentioned an app at some point. Everybody has an app of some sort in their mobile phones nowadays. So a token system and a system that will make circular economy start from the base and from the general population is probably crucial. Someone mentioned that everybody wants to make to create or to make the world a better place. I've seen places where that's not so evident, and actually economic considerations go above everything else, right? And the environment suffers because of that, of course. So not everybody thinks the same way about the environment, even in Europe, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I know you work in the plastics, the pollution of oceans and plastics, and the idea that how do you clean up the oceans in terms of removal of plastics and incentivization.
There are medium-sized companies with divers who do that already, and they export what they pick up to countries like Germany, Poland, where they can be recycled those materials. But at the base level, so at the level of the local population, that drive is not there yet, and those are the main polluters. So the people who don't want to pollute, they pollute because they are distracted or don't care because they don't care about polluting. They know they are polluting, but they just don't care.
So Jason, go ahead, and then Sinclair. Sorry, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the remark before about taxpayers and should they pay for it. I think firstly there is a strong argument here because you're dealing with something that has a lot of public good utility type characteristics around. There's free rider problems, there's coordination problems, there's market failure problems. It fits a lot of those boxes. So that the problem is which taxpayers. Because this is a global thing. So is it American taxpayers? Is it Spanish taxpayers? Is it everyone? Now we've got a taxpayer free rider problem. If the Americans are paying, I don't need to, we'll let them cover it. And it's the same thing, sort of, global asteroid defense or something. There are some sort of genuine public goods that would seem to have an obvious answer. We'll collectively fund it, and then immediately run into the problem that we don't have a collective public finance mechanism at a global scale to solve this problem. So, there is in part, it could be, maybe this is a role for international treaties to come together and we pool our resources and we do it in that sense. But again, it's perfect in the end. Let's not the perfect be the enemy of the good here. This is, again, I think the argument for a market solution is actually just that it just might be faster or more than that. But I think, this is this has a lot of public good qualities. There is a strong argument for this being publicly provided and financed. It's just not practical for many of these types of goods, not all, but some.
Fascinating. I guess if it's a virtual global token, then that might introduce a new kind of tax mechanism, like Ethereum, and how do you tax Ethereum or Bitcoin, for example?
I mean, just on that very point. I mean, I think a new global tax system is evolving, and it's Vitalik is at the center of it, as the collecting fees from all around the world to provide the public infrastructure. So that might be the solution, that basically the blockchains themselves become effectively the providing public goods and are taking sort of that's not a it's not a poll tax. There's no democracy there. There's a whole lot of issues about why that isn't, but it's an interesting problem to consider, I think, in that respect.
Yeah, Abdulhakim.
Yeah,
sorry.
I mean, I wanted to add that in my opinion, taxing is not a good idea because people hate taxes. They are overtaxed. So I don't think that they will be happy to to have another tax. So we'll just let the thing work itself. I mean, in my opinion.
Tiago, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of like a global taxing, also like do you see that this GDPR type of regulation would be global? Because there are many issues or articles in GDPR that are conflicting with the core ethos of blockchain, like right to forget, personal control, and stuff like that, right? So, do you think that this type of GDPR type of data management or data regulation would be global, like tax you are thinking about? What's the view?
Yeah, maybe Katrien, in terms of legislation, GDPR is about, I mean, GDPR, there's the PIPEDA in New Zealand, there's the Data Protection Act in the UK now that we have Brexit. So whoever thought of that? So I think the question is, we have different, privacy laws globally. There are many commonalities in many of these privacy laws also. Even in China, they have, data privacy legislation. So the question is, right, that GDPR says that I can ask for my data to be removed if I want to take away my consent. And so if GDPR legislation is applied to blockchain, then some blocks might have to be removed while still maintaining the blockchain to be consistent overall. So the question is privacy laws, as Imtiaz mentioned, conflicting with the use of blockchains? I wonder what your thoughts are from a legislation perspective, Katrien.
Yes. So in short, yes, there are some conflicts between them, but they're not insurmountable. So from anecdotal evidence I've gathered, generally there are ways to get around it, but I don't have the technical expertise to understand. But there are issues because once the block exists, then because of its potential permanence, then there are issues with that, in short.
Okay, great. Ali, please go ahead, and then Abdulhakim. Ali, just unmute and put your camera on.
Yeah, sure. So,
thank you.
So I just wanted to kind of extend the question. Who do you go to ask something to be removed from Bitcoin or Ethereum? Who owns it, right? If it was a company or Facebook, you will go to Facebook. Who do you go to ask something to be removed from Bitcoin? And it's a distributed ledger. Isn't that the beauty of it?
Well, in theory, you could, right? So in theory, if you maintain a private blockchain, you could be requested the right. So ownership is another issue, right? So who owns the blockchain, and who is the technical coordinator? I think if you have a partition blockchain, who owns it is another interesting question. Who is actually exactly what you said, right? So who do you go to get maintenance on the blockchain for whatever, if it violates privacy laws or violates other constraints, who do you go to? That's a very good question. Abdulhakim, so.
No, I mean, public blockchain, you cannot do much, but the vision for blockchain is that you will control your own data, because your data in general, you will not store it in blockchain. Let's take the example, for example, of healthcare data. I mean, the access control and everything is in the blockchain, but the data is off-chain, and you control it, and you share it with whomever you want. And this is the vision for blockchain. I mean, really, the vision is not Facebook, not I don't know. You own your own data, you control the access, and you can even monetize it. You can even make money with your data. For example, using federated learning. If somebody wants to learn from your data, he can learn without having access to your data. Just he has access only to the results, for example, of the learning algorithm. And we have been working on this using federated learning. You own your own data, you control it, and you can even make money with it. And this is the vision for blockchain.
Yeah, exactly. But that happens when the data is off-chain and you're only anchoring the access and everything on the blockchain. My point is that when something accidentally ends up on the blockchain and it falls under GDPR or whatever data protection law, now who do you go and say,
No, you can't. You can't. I mean, Bitcoin, Ethereum, the public blockchain, you can't.
It's the public
It's
infrastructure.
decentralized. There is no centralized entity.
True. Thank you.
Okay, guys. So we're just at 2:30 now. So we've had this panel for 1.5 hours. So I think maybe we should wrap up. So first of all, thank you for everybody for coming to this. We're really, really grateful to consider the different views. So if I may just quickly summarize, be bold enough to summarize, if I may use a word. So I think markets will play a very important role. I fully think that element has come across very clearly. The economics of blockchains, and particularly the economics of blockchains in a circular supply chain, is very important. The use of a token and a global regulation that can support the token, I think, has come across very clearly. The concept of, who owns the blockchain, who do you go to in terms of maintenance, and also how do you deal with a global system of tokens, who manages it? Is there a precedent? Who pays for it? I think is a very important consideration. I think the other thing that came out to me, very clearly is also this idea that, the multi-layered element of blockchain management, that you have not just a single blockchain that can be what we call the internet of blockchains, or the connectivity of blockchains, and how you coordinate that, how do you partition that, how do you maintain that over long periods of time. I think also was very, very clear here. And I think the provenance issue that Sinclair you raised, and I think it remains a kind of major challenge. And I think the other thing that came out is from Tiago's comments also, that we need the show and tell of how blockchains are actually used, rather than I think we have a lot of tech people and tech industry who've demonstrated scalability, benefit, but probably we need to take it back into communities, particularly end user communities in environmental sciences, and actually show them the use of it, and really describe the benefit to get more buy-in from these communities. Because otherwise it'll remain a technology which computer science departments push, but until we have actual use and economics, I don't think this will survive. Would you agree with those comments? Any final thoughts?
That sounds good. I fully endorse all of that.
Gosh, wow. Okay, so we end on convergence. So, well, thank you very much. I know it's coming up to 2:30 a.m. in the UK, and I know Katrien and Imtiaz and Tiago and Ali, we probably want to go to bed. So thank you very much for everybody from Melbourne. So RMIT, Abdulhakim, thank you for joining us from Montreal, and Katrien from Coventry, and thank you guys. So we'll put it on YouTube, and let's see, we'll get some more feedback from people on YouTube. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.